I would like to warmly welcome you to the seminar of loss and damage. How is it relevant to farmers' organizations? This seminar is a part of the ongoing series of UN climate negotiation related seminars organized by Pan-African Farmers Organization, PAFO, and the Andreas Hermes Academy, World Farmers Organization, and Food and Forest Development Finland. As we are already familiar with each other, we will not have a round of introductions of the organizers. Instead, we prefer to dedicate this limited time to hear the latest of this topical issue from the invited experts, and of course, give the floor to the farmers' organizations joining this seminar. Having said that, I would like to briefly introduce myself. I'm Noora Simola, climate and forestry expert of Food and Forest Development Finland, and also your moderator in this seminar. I would also like to introduce my colleague from PAFO, Emerance Tuishime, who will take care of the technical coordination of this event and will let you know about the English-French translation option and the house rules. Emerance, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Noora. Good morning, everybody. I am Emerance Tuishime, the Programs Officer of PAFO, and I'm joining you from Kigali at the headquarters of PAFO. So before I present you the in-house rules, please note that we have a French and English simultaneous interpretation. So you can click on the interpretation icon below on your screen and choose the language of your choice. So dear participants, in case you are not intervening, we will kindly ask you to mute your microphone. And in case you would like to intervene, to ask a question or comment, you can raise your hand or you can put your question in chat box, and we'll be more than happy to compile all your comments for later. So for speakers, also in case you're intervening, please be mindful on the background noise and distraction around you as much as possible. And when you are intervening, turn on your camera because we'll be happy to see your face. So I thank you once again. Noora, over to you. I'll be following on chat box. Thank you.
Thank you, Emerance. So once again, welcome. We all know that farmers around the world have been coping with variable weather, pests, and other risks through the time. They are real experts in creating strategies for securing production, but due to climate change, the challenges are now greater than ever. By timely and planned action, farmers may avoid severe livelihood impacts caused by climate hazards such as drought, flooding, hot spells, irregularity of rains, intense storms, and so on. However, sometimes the impacts are not avoidable or the means are not enough. Various studies suggest that the economic output continues shrinking significantly due to climate change. Based on the training survey conducted prior to this seminar series, farmers' organizations were especially interested in 4 topics. They were access to climate funding, agriculture-related decisions and processes in UNFCCC, adaptation and loss and damage, and finally, how to influence the negotiations. So I think that today's seminar will touch very much all of these topics, so it shall be very interesting. And thank you, Emerance, for the housekeeping rules. We are, of course, hoping to have very active participation, and may our discussions be fruitful and respectful. About the program today, let's Apologies, I had a little hurdle with my screen. The content of today's seminar, I think the objectives that we have are that we aim to have greater understanding together of the concepts and process of loss and damage in the UN climate negotiation framework. We hope to have greater awareness of the relevance of loss and damage to farmers' organizations, also by identifying farmers' realities, national, local realities, and farmers' organization role in support of loss and damage. To learn about the outlook, what can we expect from the COP28? What kind of decisions have been taken and what is next on the table regarding loss and damage? But also, importantly, to identify ways for farmers' organizations to contribute to the discussion on loss and damage and have influence. And our program today includes expert presentations, group and plenary discussions. And after me, we have two expert presentations. We have Camilla More, who is an IIED researcher and expert on global climate law and governance. She's also experienced advisor to the least developed countries at UN climate change negotiations. After Camilla, we have Gabriel Kpaka, who is a Deputy Director General and a UNFCCC focal point in the Sierra Leone Meteorological Agency. I assume that with these speakers, we can learn from the importance of the loss and damage to farmers' organizations, but also to look a bit behind the scenes to the negotiation with the personal experience of these experts. After these two presentations, we have a question and answer session, followed by a group discussion in breakout rooms. These breakout rooms are language-based, thus we have an English-speaking group and French-speaking group, facilitated by Tiina, Huvio, and Noora Simola. And finally, we come back to the plenary discussion and end up with the conclusions of this seminar. But now at this point, I would like to give the floor to Camilla More from IIED and her presentation, Loss and Damage in the UNFCCC, is what we're gonna hear next. Camilla, the floor is yours. I stop sharing.
Thanks very much. Let me try and share my screen. Go for that. That one looks right. You can see that. Oh, are you seeing everything or just my slide? You can
it's
see the
fine.
slide.
It's perfect.
Okay, good.
It's on the presentation mode. Thank you.
Super. Thank you. Super. So thanks for the introduction. Yes, I'm researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and an advisor to the Least Developed Countries group in the climate negotiations, specifically working with the negotiators on loss and damage. So here to talk to you about how the process has come about in the UNFCCC negotiations and how it is shaping up. So the UNFCCC's working definition of loss and damage refers to the actual and potential manifestation of climate change impacts that negatively affect human and natural systems. So it's now quite well understood that and accepted that it's poorer countries and communities bearing the overwhelming costs of climate change, while the wealthy countries have disproportionately contributed to the global emissions and caused it. So is used to refer to the actual manifestation of those impacts. So it can result from both slow onset climate events and extreme events. So slow onset processes, including desertification, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, and then sudden onset events, which are increasing in severity and frequency due to climate change, such as cyclones, wildfires, floods. And then they can result both in economic loss and damage, which is sort of loss and damage to resources, goods, infrastructure, and then non-economic loss and damage. So the loss of life, biodiversity, heritage, culture, health, you cannot put a value on. And it could refer to direct loss and damage. For example, the loss of crops and livestock from floodwater, damage to infrastructure from hurricanes, and also indirect loss and damage. So disruption to transport as a consequence of floodwater, or the loss of value added in commerce, interruption due to extreme weather events. Stress and anxiety could also be considered loss and damage. So it's becoming more and more recognized, and that's thanks very much as well to the IPCC. The latest synthesis report was quite clear on loss and damage. It makes clear that widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere have occurred, and that human-caused climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region of the globe, spread adverse impacts and related loss and damages to nature and to people. And that vulnerable countries who have historically contributed the least to climate change are disproportionately affected. It goes on and sets out economic damages from climate change have been detected in sectors such as agriculture. It also has some discussion on the soft limits and hard limits of adaptation, and the limits of adaptation being reached. So soft limits are those that in theory could be overcome with greater resources or greater adaptation efforts. Or efforts were possible through more resources. While the hard limits are sort of physical and technical limitations, and they're also being reached. So where it's no longer possible to do anything, it's simply unavoidable, loss and damage will result. And the report sets out that both soft limits and hard limits are being reached, particularly experienced by small-scale farmers and households along low-lying coastal communities. And there's various constraints which are taking farmers to those limits. But it's clear that adaptation does not prevent all losses and damages. And that with increasing global warming, as we know, we're on path to, there will be increased loss and damage and increased adaptation limits reached. So this figure sort of sets out some of the wide variety of losses and damages that can be expected as a result of climate change. This comes from the IPCC latest synthesis report as well. So it shows adverse impacts on water availability and food production, including agriculture production, animal and livestock health and productivity, and fisheries yields and aquaculture production. Also adverse impacts on health and well-being, and on cities, settlements and infrastructure, and biodiversity and ecosystems. So there's obviously clearly link between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. But there's been increasing effort in the UN climate policy space to distinguish between these three sort of policy areas, and while acknowledging that they're very much connected. So obviously mitigating climate change by reducing global greenhouse gas emissions will limit hazards, reduce the number of hazards, and thereby minimize loss and damage. The IPCC has said that near-term actions to limit warming to 1.5 would substantially reduce loss and damage, but cannot eliminate it all. Then measures to help societies adapt to the impacts of climate change reduces exposure and vulnerability to those hazards, and so it also reduces loss and damage. For example, changing what is planted when and where, for example, planting more resilient varieties may lessen the impacts and reduce the overall cost borne by climate change. But as the previous slide set out, the IPCC is clear that there are limits to the extent that adaptation activities can avert loss and damage. And indeed, some limits to adaptation are already being reached. So under all assessed scenarios for adaptation and mitigation, some risk from adverse impacts remains. So while mitigating climate change and adapting to its impacts obviously critical, they're no longer enough, and there's this recognized need to additionally address loss and damage. So in the UNFCCC process that is ongoing to develop appropriate mechanisms to do that, recognizing that it's materializing because mitigation and adaptation efforts have been inadequate to date. So the effects of climate change are costing hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And as I said, and you all know, these are disproportionately borne by households and communities that in countries that have contributed the least to climate change. So their estimates range from 290 billion to by 2030, rising to 1 trillion in 2050. The IPCC says that the annual costs of damages from sea level rise alone could reach 427 billion by 2100. And there's obviously many other impacts other than sea level rise causing damage. So the annual cost is huge. And in addition, development gains are eroded due to impacts of climate change. So the vulnerable group of 20, which comprises 58 countries, put out a report that states the V20 countries are estimated to have lost 20% of their GDP due to the adverse impacts of climate change. So, and in addition, as we mentioned, there's unquantifiable costs, the non-economic loss and damage, the adverse impacts to ecosystems, living standards, health, life, water security, etc. So currently, domestic budgets.
Camilla.
Yes.
Excuse me, I interrupt you.
No, of course.
Like this, but we have some translation issues.
Oh,
the French
Question d'interprétation parce que
is not working very well. Luckily, we have your slides translated. Emeran shared them in the chat. But perhaps if you could talk slightly slower,
Of course.
the simultaneous translation would benefit from that. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thanks for noting. Sorry, my French is terrible. This slide just is setting out that we've seen loss and damage, costing hundreds of billions a year. And currently at the international level, there's not these mechanisms really to pay for it. So the cost is being picked up by individuals and households and communities who are suffering the impacts and bearing the costs, including farmers. So when a crop fails, it's the farmers shouldering the costs of that. Developing countries are increasingly investing significant amounts of domestic resources to fund activities related to addressing loss and damage. And this means they're redirecting resources away from other really critical expenditures and setting back development efforts. So, for example, after being hit by Hurricane Eta and Iota in a span of 2 weeks in November 2020, Honduras received US $7 million in international aid, and a further 11.4 million was pledged. And meanwhile, the government expended 125 million from its national treasury. That was to support rehabilitation and reconstruction. It also had to repurpose and reprioritize loans from multilateral development banks that were initially intended for sustainable development efforts, but needed to be redirected for the emergency response and the reconstruction. Another example is Morocco, which faced the worst drought in 40 years in 2021. It dispersed $1 billion in public funds to respond to the loss and damage through a program that aimed to protect animal and plant capital, manage water scarcity, and provide agricultural insurance and financial support to farmers and breeders. Sri Lanka has also invested in public risk transfer mechanisms, including a universal crop insurance covering all farmers, which ensures farmers against loss and damage due to floods, droughts, dry spells, excess water, pests, and diseases. So how is loss and damage being addressed in the UNFCCC negotiations? We've seen this huge cost is being borne by the most vulnerable. And the issue has been incredibly political and progress has been quite slow. Developing countries have long called for rich developed countries with historic responsibility for climate change to provide support to address loss and damage experienced as a result of it. But developed nations have historically rejected any notion of the idea of liability or being required to pay compensation. They've tried to avoid discussion of liability and compensation by framing the issue as a matter that can be addressed through adaptation and emphasizing the overlap with disaster risk reduction and humanitarian efforts. So you'll see as well, we'll go through the process of the negotiations, but in negotiating the Paris Agreement, for example, it includes a separate article on loss and damage, which was seen as a win, but the phrase used is to enhance actions for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And this takes away from a bit of focus away from the addressing and encompasses the minimizing and averting to, which could include the adaptation and mitigation efforts. So you can scale up any climate action and say you're sort of dealing with this problem without necessarily addressing the loss and damage that has manifested. So developing countries have long called for action and support to specifically address loss and damage. Briefly on the key moments and how it's developed over time. It was in 1991 that the Alliance of Small Island States submitted a proposal for an insurance pool to compensate small island developing states for the impacts of sea level rise. The proposal wasn't accepted, but the idea was seeded that support is needed to address loss and damage, and efforts continued to see this be realized. In 2007, the term loss and damage first appeared in COP decision. The negotiations resulted in the Bali Action Plan, which called for enhanced action on adaptation, including means to address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts in developing countries. In 2013, parties established the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which was to address loss and damage associated with impacts of climate change. It was acknowledged in that decision that loss and damage associated with climate change includes, and in some cases involves, more than that which can be reduced by adaptation. So the WIM, as it's known, was established with three functions. First, to enhance knowledge and understanding of loss and damage. Second, to strengthen dialogue, coordination, coherence, and synergies on loss and damage. And the third was to enhance action and support, which includes finance, technical support, technology, and capacity building. So the WIM, and then in 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted. I've already mentioned Article 8 of that is a separate article dedicated to loss and damage, which recognizes the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, and provides that parties should enhance understanding, action, and support with respect to loss and damage. Now, the decision accompanying the Paris Agreement, this was highly contested, but the US insisted that there's a specific paragraph explicitly stating that Article 8 of the agreement does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. So it was a step forward in getting a distinct article, but it wasn't a great basis for ensuring that action and support would really be scaled up. In 2019, the Santiago Network was established. This was a network to catalyze the technical assistance of organizations, bodies, networks, and experts to support efforts to address loss and damage in developing countries. And then most recently and most significantly at COP27, parties decided to establish a fund for responding to loss and damage. They agreed that a transitional committee would make recommendations of how that fund should work, and that committee will meet 4 times this year. Its next meeting is next week in the Dominican Republic, and it will it's still trying to work out how such a fund could operate, and it will forward those recommendations to the parties for their consideration at COP28. But as you can imagine, this highly contested political issue, there remains lots of work to sort of agree or figure out how that should operate. So this is now what we have. The Warsaw International Mechanism has, with its 3 functions I mentioned, it has an executive committee, which can be considered sort of the policy arm of the WIM. They meet, they're a group of party representatives that meet twice a year to guide the implementation of the functions of the WIM. And they have a group, a number of expert groups and task forces to guide their work. The Santiago Network, that can be considered the implementation arm. So it is tasked with linking together experts and organizations that can provide support with those countries that request support. At COP26 in Glasgow, the functions of the Santiago Network were agreed. These include catalyzing demand-driven technical assistance by identifying, prioritizing, and communicating needs and priorities, and connecting those seeking assistance with entities providing it, and facilitating, so it sort of links people, those requesting help with those that can potentially provide it. It's still not yet fully operational. Parties have agreed that it should have a secretariat to manage its everyday operations, which is overseen by an advisory board to ensure party oversight. But they are yet to decide where that secretariat should be hosted. So it will be in an existing agency. So as a result, it's been pushed back a year probably, and it should be fully operational by 2025 with interim arrangements until then. And now we also have a financial arm of the WIM, which is this new loss and damage fund and funding arrangements. So it was at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last year that parties acknowledged the urgent and immediate need for new, additional, predictable and adequate financial resources to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change in responding to economic and non-economic loss and damage, especially in the context of ongoing and ex-post action. So that it means after the event has happened, including rehabilitation, reconstruction, and recovery. The COP decided to establish new funding arrangements with a focus on addressing loss and damage, and a new fund for responding to loss and damage. And I've already talked about the transitional committee that was set up to work that out. So this figure comes from the synthesis report that the UNFCCC Secretariat put together following the first of the transitional committee meetings. And it sets out the types of actions needed along a spectrum to respond to loss and damage. So it's sort of noted that while adaptation finance, disaster risk reduction, early warnings for all, and humanitarian assistance can address some of these actions and provide funding for those actions, there are large gaps in the current financial framework that means that not all of these, the full spectrum is covered. Specifically, the synthesis report found that substantial finance gaps exist with respect to recovery and reconstruction. So, for example, out of more than $16.7 billion in development assistance in 2021 for adaptation, about 300 million was allocated to emergency response, 500 million to disaster prevention and preparedness, and only 63 million for reconstruction, relief, and rehabilitation. The synthesis report also found gaps in the focus on and finance for livelihoods, social protection, and the compounding effects of slow and sudden onset events and impacts, and also non-economic loss and damage has been identified as something that there's no funding for currently. The technical support unit, which is supporting the transitional committee in its work, has found that the existing funding arrangements for loss and damage fall far short of the current and future scale of loss and damage, and are not sufficient to address the funding gaps, and also that they're fragmented. So existing issues include speed. So there's delay between climate impacts and the funding received, which often causes escalating costs if you don't address something as soon as possible. Adequacy, it's completely underfunded, and there's a growing gap between needs and funding available, and also the types of access. So, for example, funding not being available for fragile and conflict affected states, and insurance becoming more expensive owing to the increasing frequency and severity of events as a result of climate change, and funding not reaching the most vulnerable populations. So, for example, internally displaced people. This diagram just shows quite clearly the humanitarian assistance funding gap. Funding required, you can see, continues to increase, partly due to worsening climate change. but humanitarian funding is not increasing at the same rate. So from a new fund, significant resources would be needed. The fund must provide adequate support to match the scale of challenges, and funding must be new and additional to existing climate finance, humanitarian assistance, and official ODA, official development assistance, not just diverted or rebranded. It should not be debt creating. It's been found that over 50% of debt increase in vulnerable countries is now related to funding disaster recoveries. So it would not be helpful to create new debt burdens for countries that are addressing climate impacts for which they're not responsible. So especially and particularly poor countries or countries in debt crisis, which so primarily grant-based to not add to the financial burden of those countries in severe debt distress. And it needs to have the ability to respond to different types of loss and damage and at different sort of time scales. So, for example, the least developed countries group envisions a fund with three windows. One would rapidly disperse funding for immediate response to extreme events. Then there'd be an intermediate window for ongoing recovery and rehabilitation, which perhaps would be more programmatically planned out and not necessarily released instantly and of a greater scale. And then a more chronic needs window for programmatic grants for recovering from the effects of slow onset events and ongoing impacts of climate change. So that's it's the slow onset events that's fairly now widely accepted to be a clear gap in existing funding arrangements, because obviously if something is slowly eroding away and slowly creating this cost, there's no event to trigger humanitarian assistance, for example. So that's one where there's a clear gap and a need to address. This is my final slide, and it just sets out what's to be expected at COP28. So there's obviously the transitional committee will forward its recommendations to the COP, and hopefully a new fund and funding arrangements which are effective will be established. There's also the Santiago network I mentioned. There will need to be a decision on where that will be hosted. It's also the first global stocktake, which is to assess collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the Paris Agreement and its goals. And it's expected that loss and damage will be considered there, both in terms of acknowledging that the loss and damage that is already being experienced and expected to be experienced as a measure of the progress being made towards the Paris Agreement goals, which is clearly inadequate, but also in sort of assessing what else needs to be done in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, so including Article 8's enhancing action and support for loss and damage. And there's also consideration continuing on the new collective quantified goal for climate finance. So some parties are calling for that to include a separate sub-goal on loss and damage. This is to replace the $100 billion goal or commitment that was made in 2009, where developed countries pledged to mobilize $100 billion by a year, by 2020, something they have not managed to deliver on. There's deliberations are ongoing for a new goal to be set from 2025, and the countries are calling for that to actually reflect the level of finance needed, which we've seen is far greater than 100 billion a year, and to also include the costs of loss and damage. So that is that is the background of what is happening in the UNFCCC space, how loss and damage has and continues to be considered. And I welcome, your questions, but pass back to you, Noora.
Thank you so much, Camilla, for your excellent presentations. I think that we could have a questions session, questions and answers, if Camilla, you would be available for that. There was plenty of content for us, and I'm sure that both the institutional structures and the sort of outreach of the activities relevant to farmers are creating questions. But would there be anyone amongst the participants who would like to take the floor? Any questions? You may raise your hand from the reactions button, or you may write your question to the chat box. I see there Isidro, please.
Thank you and good morning to everyone. My name is Isidro Macaring and I speak from Mozambique. I work for UNAC, which is the National Small Scale Farmers Union, and we are members of SACAO, which facilitated our participation in this seminar. For us, is very important. I would like to know from Camilla, well, this is a new topic for me personally. Of course, we've heard about loss and damage, which was congratulated in being established in the last COP. For me, the question is this fund for loss and damage already active, and is it managed by the government? For example, if countries like Mozambique, which is a developing country and also one of the most affected by natural disasters caused by climate change, is this fund being, is the government responsible to apply for the funds, or national farmers organization like ours can also have opportunity to assess it? And what's the difference of this fund with other, like we know, like GF and also the environmental fund? So for now, my questions are these. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Very good questions. So first, it's not yet active. It's still being developed. Depending on how complex it is made to be, the timeline for when it will be giving out money. And for that, of course, it needs to have money in it. So that's also requires political will from donor countries. It is hard to say. The GCF, when that was set up, there was, I think, maybe 6 years between it being established in a decision and it being giving out any funds. But I think there's a lot of interest in moving this much quicker, and I think it will be it seems likely that it will be a trust, for example, under the World Bank maybe, which would not take as long to set up as a full system. So that is question one. It's not yet functioning, but hopefully next year, I say optimistically. On whether it will be receiving money through the government or through, for example, organizations at the more community level, that is also still up for discussion. So these things weren't set out in the COP decision that established the fund. It was just decided that a fund would be established. So if that is something that you would all find useful, that is something that you could be championing. Civil society is for example, the Climate Action Network, I think in their proposal for the fund, they propose a window that a special sort of subset of the fund, which is specifically set aside as a small grants window, which can be directly applied for from civil society organizations and NGOs, perhaps in addition to a fund, the other windows, which may be the government, for example, whichever ministry is nominated or dedicated, would be tasked with putting together its plans, perhaps for how we're going to address the full spectrum of these loss and damage, and then it can apply for the funding. But as there's also hope that, and this goes to the next question of how it's different to those other funds, which that's how you access those, is you put together a proposal and maybe a few years or months later you might see money. There's hope that this will also have ability to rapidly disperse funding to address those immediate needs. So one thing we've been looking at is the EU has a solidarity fund, for example, where EU states who experience a natural disaster can very quickly get funding to support the recovery, because it's those immediate funds that minimize the overall cost of recovery, because the longer you wait, the higher those costs get. Other things that would be different about it, we hope, its general principles of sort of being based on the polluter pays principle and principles of equity. And yeah, it's sort of yet to be seen, but I think there's wide acknowledgement across all parties that it wouldn't be at all useful to create something that looks like the existing financial mechanism. There's understanding that those funding mechanisms aren't covering all the costs or dealing with all the problems that climate change is presenting. But it's to be decided. So if there's specific things that farmers organizations would find useful, definitely advocate for them, because there's still time.
The participants are still most welcome to present more questions, but meanwhile I could quickly ask about basically, because there is not yet precise definition of the loss and damage, so perhaps it's still time to sort of influence the definition. And so I'm wondering that, for example, for farmers organizations, perhaps quite wide scope or for wide definition, covering from preparedness to response and recovery and sort of slow onset and extreme weather events would be covered by this fund. So would you have any practical examples from your experience? You mentioned the Climate Action Network example already, but how farmers organizations could perhaps get their voice heard by these like institutions that are involved in this discussion, or perhaps then a wider public, because I'm thinking that, for example, the Santiago Network or the Transition Committee, who are they composed of? Is there like any way to approach them? So on. If you have any examples, good examples that comes to your mind about the advocacy.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Not really my area of expertise, but I would say that it's the transitional committee is made up of government representatives, and we hope are representing the interests of all the people. So there's also opportunity for civil society to provide submissions sometimes. I don't know if there's any coming up, but I think you could, for example, even the details of members of the transitional committee, I would think would be quite accessible. And if they're not, I can help you access them. But I would, I'm sure they're all willing to meet with the people who are most affected by these issues and representatives of them. So I think they'd be very eager to meet with people like representatives of farmers organizations to hear really what's needed on the ground. And it would help them as well, because then they can take that evidence back to the committee meetings and share what is actually needed and why current financial landscape may not be meeting all the needs. And I think that would apply to most of these negotiators. Always, yeah, happy to meet with civil society and ensure that they're best representing you in these spaces.
Thank you. Is there still some more questions amongst the participants? Oh, Keris has been writing to the chat as well, and is saying that the farmers constituency gets the opportunity to participate in transitional committee meetings as observers. This is great. We have one virtual representative at the next meeting who will report back. This is great.
That's great. Well, I'm glad to hear
yes. Maybe just a final question still on the financing models. Now what is on the table, do you see that there will be a bigger role in the humanitarian organizations? Do you think that the development banks will have specific roles amongst these finance mechanisms, or where do you see that these negotiations are going to?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The decision established both a new fund, but within the context of new funding arrangements, and funding arrangements have been sort of interpreted to be all these existing things, so humanitarian assistance, MBDs, and the new sort of initiatives like the Global Shield, early warning for all. And it's sort of encouraging other new funding arrangements that sort of are independent and operate outside and don't have oversight and guidance of the UNFCCC and the COP. But in addition to that, recognizing this need for something even new and additional to that. But I think, yeah, there's a role for everyone and everything. And definitely it's been highlighted that humanitarian assistance is really critical and can be scaled up massively. And they've come to the various workshops and transitional committee meetings and shared their learnings and where they're not managing to fill the gaps, or when they maybe leave and then development steps in, but there's a gap in between there that's sort of not addressed, or lack of coherence in linking things up, so people and issues falling through gaps. So I think one of the other roles that this new fund and funding arrangements will have, or it's envisioned to have, is a sort of coordination or coherence and trying to make each of those existing funding arrangements as efficient and effective as possible by better coordination amongst them as well.
Thank you. Prince, please.
Thank you for the presentation. First, for me to centralize explain whether if there's damage caused by extreme weather, then I think maybe I need some explanation on the law. What could this be? Could it be
Apologies, Prince. The audio is really bad. Would you be able to talk louder, or perhaps write to the chat box your message, your question?
Okay, let me write.
We can't really hear you. Yes, I'm sorry, we can't really hear you. So if you can improve your microphone settings or write the question to the chat box, that would help. Okay, maybe the connection is not good. In that case, here we have a question. Could you please, Camilla, explain the damage caused by examples of the damage caused by the slow onset events? Perhaps you could, you know, like explain what is slow onset event by a few examples, and then the type of damage that they may cause.
Yeah, so the classic example of a slow onset impact is gradual sea level rise. So that can slowly erode away beaches and cause increased salt intrusion into degrading land, taking away land, people having to slowly move back, living off the land, or changing the fishery, affecting the fisheries. But there's no clear moment in time that damage is a climate impact is happening and support is needed to address the effects of it. It's just slowly over time creating maybe it's more other than the non economic loss and damage, but if it was, for example, affecting farmers or fishers, it may be a case of just yields slowly decreasing, or the impact is not happening. There's no specific moment where you can say that happened and now we need, for example, humanitarian assistance to help respond, or even something to trigger insurance. So it's a more difficult issue to address, and current it's not really clear how best to address it. Some of it involves displacement eventually, and having to move, or whole islands disappearing, whole communities needing to out of the country, and with that comes all sort of social issues and all sorts of different cascading damages that result from those impacts, which need a more comprehensive and better thought out way to deal with them. At the moment, it's just dealt with by the individuals experiencing that loss.
Thank you. And Tiina, Huvio pointed out in the chat that Camilla has good examples of the slow onset events also in the slides. And there is another question about if the slides will be shared, or also the English presentations after this event. And yes, they will be shared. There is one more question. We take a final question from Tiina, please.
Thanks, Noora. Thanks, Camilla, for the presentation. I hope I am audible enough. I just wanted to take you back. You discussed the politics around this, and you mentioned that the developed nations are sort of denying that they are liable to this. And the expectation is that they are going to be the ones to put through some funds to the loss and damage. Are we already not starting on a bad footing that on one hand we are establishing a fund that is supposed to assist, but those who have the pace are sort of not committing themselves? That's the first one. The second one is on, I feel it's a little bit complicated that we are focusing on loss and damage more than maybe strengthening issues to do with the early warning systems. So we are actually accepting that the damage and the loss has to happen first, and then given the slowness in the movement of funds from the would-be donors to the communities that are going to be continuously affected by the climate change disasters, I think we would rather maybe focus on strengthening early warning systems, including moving people who are already vulnerable from the places they are already to safer spaces than to wait for them to get into these problems, and then we look at trying to alleviate it much later. Thanks.
Yeah, very good question and really great points. On the willingness of developed countries, I think, yes, historically, definitely have tried to avoid this issue because they don't want to have to pay for these huge costs, and there's still evidence that that is the case. But having said that, this sort of agreement to establish a fund obviously was an agreement that there would be funding available, and I think there's this now political pressure and this new sort of solidarity framing of it actually also, if you know, the costs come back to them as well, there's incentive to address these issues, even just supply chain issues that they'll face otherwise. Like it's in their interest to address this global issue globally. So I think that funds will be made available. Having said that, as you've said, there's already this huge lack of funding for, you know, early warning systems and for adaptation. And of course, that's where loss and damage can be avoided. It absolutely must be. You know, some loss and damage, as we've said, is irreversible. You know, the loss, that means it's lost. Damage you can maybe repair, but of course it's absolutely best avoided. And so efforts must be focused on mitigation and adaptation. But the science says that that's just not enough, and it's just not fair that it's currently, the costs are there and they're being spent, they're being experienced, but they're being absorbed by the people and the communities who didn't cause it. So as well as that, yes, there's a need for more adaptation finance, greater mitigation efforts. And actually, I see that the requirement or the moral obligation to provide support for addressing loss and damage is actually also greater incentive to mitigate climate change. And we hope that it will get those leading countries to take better efforts there. There's also lots of ideas and talk about various innovative sources of finance, many of which are in line with the polluter pays principle. So whether it's fossil fuel taxes or carbon taxes, a fossil fuel levy, you know, trying to make progressive taxes, sort of like there's airline passenger levy talk. I think there's been a paper around about if you just added an extra $5 to the, you know, the ticket price of every airline passenger. That targets the richest and the because they're the ones flying and the most responsible, how many hundreds of billions you quite quickly generate. So I think money is around. It's at the moment probably flowing in the wrong direction, and these fossil fuel production is being subsidized rather than taxed. And I think establishing this fund at the international level, putting that incentive on governments and saying, what are you going to do about, they have to really consider what they can do at home to change their systems to make money flow in the right direction. And I think company and corporate private sector finance will come into it as well. But yes, I think it's hard because it seems like the focus is on loss and damage, and that was the topic of this presentation and what I focus my work on. But it's sort of, we're getting there now because it's been ignored for the last 30 years. The Kyoto Protocol focused only on mitigation, adaptation, then got a bit more focus, and absolutely need to continue the push on those activities and agree. If you can get early warning systems set up in every country and move people away from where the hazard's coming, that's absolutely way better than waiting for the hazard to hit and trying to address it after. But some is unavoidable, and so we need to be ready to deal with that as well. Sorry, I ranted a bit there.
Okay. Camilla, I would like to thank you and IIED very much for this very informative first hour in our seminar.